Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar on unlocking private capital for sustaining SDG impacts presented by Arif Naki. I'm Julia Jovino, and I'm a project management intern for the SDG philanthropy platform. The webinar will be recorded, and there will be the possibility to ask questions through the chat or questions section, and they will be addressed at the end of the session. Now I will pass the floor to Carolina Misk, our policy specialist.
Good afternoon, everyone who joined us this webinar today, and I have a pleasure of introducing today's title, which is Unlocking Private Capital for Sustaining SDG Impacts. And specifically, I would like to introduce Arif Neki, who is Advisor for Strategic Partnerships at the UN Resident Coordinator Office in Kenya. And he's also managing the SDG Partnership Platform in Kenya. Arif has a long standing experience in the field of private sector philanthropy, as well as global development. And Arif has been working with us on the SDG philanthropy platform in Kenya since its very inception back in 2014. And so in today's webinar, Arif will introduce the journey that we took in Kenya for during this last 2.5 years, when we started off a conversation with the private sector and philanthropy on how we can all partner together for the SDGs. And we will show, and he will speak to the results of what has happened, and namely, he will talk about all the wonderful innovations that have taken place during just 2.5 years. And so, without much ado, I would like to give the floor to Arif. Arif, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Carolina. It's a pleasure and a delight to be presenting at this webinar, and thank you to all the participants who've logged in. We appreciate your interest, and we look forward to your active participation. So as Carolina mentioned, the subject matter is really about unlocking private and philanthropic capital for SDG impacts. And what we'd like to do is maybe run you through the experience in Kenya, which might be, in a sense, indicative of many of the contexts in Africa that the government, civil society, and stakeholders are facing as we try to drive SDG impacts across the continent. We know that there's been a fairly long and exciting series of consultations to develop the SDGs. I think 2 key lessons that came out of the MDG experience would be that number one, it needs to be owned by all members of society. This is not a top-down agenda. This is not an agenda exclusively for the UN or exclusively for the government, but this is an agenda for all of humanity. And so we need a very broad consultative process in order to get the ownership buy-in and the right configuration and design of SDGs. So personally, I'm convinced that what we've ended up with in this adoption of the 17 goals and 169 targets and over 200 odd indicators is a truly transformational agenda. I think this is an agenda that is not simply pushing back the date on MDGs by another 15 years and calling it something else. It's not old MDG wine in a new SDG bottle. I think it's truly transformative, and there are many people, at least in Kenya, that I know that are very excited from a whole number of sectors. And why are they excited? And I think they're excited because this allows us to learn the second lesson from the MDG experience, which is to say that we can't just work with the usual suspects. We can't just work with the traditional players in mainstream development, with the UN, with the bilaterals, the multilaterals, and government alone. But we really need to truly harness all sectors of society. We need to bring in civil society, the faith-based groups. We need to bring in philanthropy. We need to bring in the foundations and trusts that have been so active over the generations. We also need to bring in private sector. And so the context really in Africa has been, in Kenya particularly, has been that you have kind of two views of where Kenya is going. The first view that you hear oftentimes is that there is a really exciting growth. You're looking at 5 to 6% GDP growth year on year. You're looking at essentially the Geneva of East Africa, the financial and banking capital. We're now pretty much becoming an impact investment hub. We're launching an African Venture Philanthropy Alliance next month. We're looking at a number of private equity partners coming here. So you're seeing a fair amount of buzz around financial markets, around innovative and blended financing. What you're also seeing is technology, how Kenya has leapfrogged technology in many ways. You remember M-Pesa was invented in Kenya, and M-Pesa is now gone around to multiple countries globally. And many more very interesting innovations have happened. And so this is becoming almost like the Silicon Savannah. So you hear this really exciting stories, young indigenous Kenyan talent, really bright, tech-savvy entrepreneurs and skilled workers. But the other story that we also need to keep in mind is that, over 50 years after independence, about 45% of the country is still living below the poverty line. So of 46 million Kenyans, not everyone's enjoying the sort of high-tech, glamorous lifestyle that you see in some of the cities. So the real issue for us is this tagline around the SDGs where we say, let's leave no one behind. I think in Kenya, we know where people have been left behind. It's very clear. There's been, a fair amount of data over the decades to understand some of the poverty indicators where we've hit them, where we haven't hit the MDGs. And also we've fairly clear that what we need to do is not just grow the economy, but we also need to address this issue of the demographics. In the context in Africa, as you know, is that it's a very young continent. The average age in Kenya is about 19. I think the average age in Europe is probably about 51. And so we've got this opportunity of what we call the demographic dividend. We have the opportunity of doing what Indonesia and Singapore and others did, which was really to engage their population, their workforce, into the economy very productively in order that they can leapfrog and become the tigers. The opportunity we have is in the next 30 or 40 years to tap this demographic dividend, to skill workers, to get young entrepreneurs active into the economy, and to avoid this situation of 60 or 70% of labor force youth being unemployed or underemployed. So how do we address this opportunity of the demographic dividend, and how do we get rich quick before we get old and get into demographic echo, like many of the Western nations are, where you have a much older population that a smaller workforce has to support. So the SDGs are critically important, and so our view was, if we would address the SDGs in Kenya, and ultimately implementation is the key, because we can have wonderful conceptual frameworks and wonderful adoption of targets and goals, but ultimately the rubber hits the road in terms of implementation on the ground. And so the opportunity to localize SDGs in a country where we've devolved to 47 counties. So we have 48 governments, we have a national government, and we have 47 county governments. How do we work with these governments? How do we support implementation of SDGs? And from the Addis conference preceding the adoption of the SDGs, we know that the Financing for Development conference, I think, spoke about a clear action, a call to action that looks at about a $4 trillion gap in terms of the budget required to implement SDGs, of which developing countries have about a $2.5 trillion gap. So I think these are UNCTAD figures. And the issue, therefore, for us is, how do you converge the actions and the activities and the energies of all sectors to come together in a country like Kenya in order that you can actually make these meaningful impacts on SDGs? Thank you. I think I'm unmuted now. So what we have conceived, therefore, was in November 2014, a number of foundations, Hilton Foundation, Ford Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, and UNDP came together and conceived a platform that can actually help create pathways for philanthropy to work much more closely with mainstream development partners. And Kenya was the first pilot country for launching this. And I was delighted and privileged to be the first coordinator for Kenya. In November 21st, 2014, we launched the platform in Kenya. And since we've launched the platform in a number of countries, Zambia, Ghana, Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil, India, China, the US, etc. So these are platforms that have been looking to support the philanthropy sector in the country, to help organize it if it's not organized. In Kenya, we were fortunate because some of us many years ago, about 15 years ago, were able to create the East African Association of Grant Makers across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. We were able to also, in the first year of the SDG platform, create the Kenya Philanthropy Forum, which is about 70 to 80 foundations and growing. And we're able to also support the engagement of philanthropy in this first common voice for philanthropy with government, with the Ministry of Education, for example, with the policymakers around the enabling environment for foundations and trusts, but also to engage them on issues around data and creating opportunities for collection and sharing of data and feeding that into an aggregated data platform that is part of Kenya's data forum, which links to the global initiative on sustainable data. And finally, but very importantly, creating pathways for philanthropy also to work with the United Nations Development Assistance Framework. Because this is a framework where all the agencies of the UN, over 25 agencies in Kenya, come together and cluster across 4 strategic result areas with ministries of education. And this was a framework that was signed at the highest level by the President Kenyatta at State House with all the agencies. So this is quite an exciting framework within which we were able to bring philanthropy into the 6 monthly meetings, the steering committee meetings, often hosted by the President himself at State House, where he acknowledged the contribution of private sector in philanthropy and the importance of bringing all sectors together. And the SDG framework gives us a great language to cut through these silos, because the kind of language and culture of each of these silos oftentimes can be quite distinctive. NGOs will speak about, work from their mindsets and from the way they organize log frames and outputs and outcomes and activities and indicators. Private sector often talks the language of triple bottom line, the language of return on investment and IRRs. Or faith-based groups often talk from a value-based approach quite strongly, with a very strong grassroots orientation. But what has given us this opportunity is to really perforate the silos and work across the SDGs with all elements. So the SDG philanthropy platform, as it grew in its activities, also took into cognizance the fact that Kenya is climbing up the middle income ladder. We are technically a lower middle income country today, notwithstanding that we have a large part of the population below poverty. And so as India and South Africa experienced, as you climb up the middle income ladder, the country becomes more debt worthy and less grant worthy. And a lot of those grant funds from bilaterals and multilaterals and foundations and others are likely to shrink. And in fact, a couple of bilaterals have already announced their intention to focus much more on trade and much less on aid, and in some cases actually cut down aid completely over the next few years. So how is Kenya going to fund its development financing for the next medium to long term? And we also therefore need to think about the transition from SDG funding to SDG financing. How can we line up the array of blended finance players, the commercial financiers, the international finance institutions, the development finance institutions, the impact investors, the venture philanthropists, the private equity groups, the equity and bond players. So as we think about funding and financing SDGs, it was important to expand the experience of the platform to help philanthropy engage much more in multi-sectoral partnerships with private sector and government and the UN as well. And so we hatched and evolved into the SDG partnership platform for Kenya. And that's the logo you see on the screen. So with the SDG partnership platform in Kenya, we developed some objectives, essentially, which is aligned with the medium-term plan 2, which is part of Kenya's Vision 2030 and the United Nations Development Assistance Framework. It is also aligned in terms of the key objectives being driving joint advocacy and policy dialogue or enabling environment for partnerships to grow and thrive. So the platform is simply a catalyst. It's simply an honest broker, and it simply helps to connect the dots and facilitate these partnerships. But we're also looking at trying to unlock private capital in a time when Kenya's grant funding will diminish. And the only serious sources of long-term development funding will be, broadening the local domestic resource mobilization by expanding the tax base, bringing in the informal sector, for example, and secondly, by all types and kinds of private capital. So can we identify and broker large transformative public-private partnerships that are aligned to the SDGs, but they are not simply CSR. This is not about corporate social responsibility. This is not about 1 or 2% on the side of a corporate budget, but this is about influencing mainstream sustainability strategies of corporates on a shared value basis, which really means that you want to open up opportunities for a win-win, to appeal to the enlightened self-interest of all players, to help corporates think about getting long-term markets, think about long-term brand loyalty, think about 200 million population market that currently is around us in Eastern Africa, with about 46 million Kenyans, with about 90 million Ethiopians, 10 million Somalis, about 30 million Ugandans, etc., and a young population with high growth rates, which will double by 2050. So this is really about a serious long-term market for private sector. We see the example of Unilever in India, for example, who came in 1908 and worked at the bottom of the pyramid and stayed the course through independence in 1947. And we know today there's about 1.3 billion Indians, of which 2 out of 3 apparently use a Unilever product every single day. So this is about serious market capitalization, but can we do it in a way that we identify transformative projects that can also impact SDG clusters and that can improve the quality of life of all Kenyans simultaneously? So it's about this balance about making and creating wealth and simultaneously accelerating SDG impacts. And that's the balance we're trying to achieve through this innovative platform in Kenya. And of course, one needs to measure the impact of the partnerships that you hatch, and to make sure that as an honest broker, the partnerships that you hatch and the transformative projects that are invested are actually demand driven. They actually address concrete needs from the ground upwards, and that these are not simply supply driven projects for selling more private sector equipment without direct match to identify needs on the ground. So the platform essentially becomes a bit of an honest broker in this process. So what we did with the platform was we had a series of World Economic Forum events in Davos, in Durban, etc. We had a couple of side events around the United Nations General Assembly. We had a side event in the HLM2, the Global Partnership for Development Effectiveness in Kenya in December 2016, when we had 150 countries come out, and also the Africa Health Business Summit. And out of this series of events and discussions, we were able to hatch the SDG partnership platform in Kenya. We don't see an exact replica of this model anywhere else, and we're tweaking it and refining it as we go along. And we have a number of very, very good, strong champions and partners with us from all sectors who are part of this collective effort. This culminated in September 2017 in the launch of the platform in New York at a side event around the UN General Assembly. We also created a multi-partner trust fund, which would be sort of a basket for funding that is held by the multi-partner trust fund office in New York for a very nominal fee as a fiduciary partner. but the spending and application decisions around the fund are actually driven by the steering committee of the platform. So this is a way to sort of improve the transparency and the collective partnerships that can drive public-private partnership investments in Kenya. And all of these events, we had the United Nations and the government of Kenya present jointly at the highest levels. And the reason we did that was because the platform is co-chaired by the government of Kenya, by the president, and by the resident coordinator for the UN, Siddharth Chatterjee, as co-chairs of the United Nations Development Assistance Framework, which provides us the governance mechanism for the platform. Moving on from that, I'm just trying to move my slide down, so bear with me. We had, after a recent election season, we had the new government established, the president sworn in, the new cabinet is in place, and President Kenyatta announced for his second and final term of office his Big Four action plan. And these Big Four priorities for the government are going to be food security, which includes agriculture, agro-food processing, nutrition, affordable housing, manufacturing, which includes links to infrastructure, and the fourth one is around affordable healthcare for all. This is really the universal health coverage agenda, the UHC agenda. So given this priority, given the fact that government ministries, UN agencies, private sector, NGOs, foundations will tend to align towards these Big Four priorities, the platform has designed its own structure in the following way. So what you see at the highest level is the governance of the platform under Kenya's Vision 2030, under the SDG Agenda 2030, and the transition from the Medium-Term Plan 2 to Medium-Term Plan 3, which happens next year, and the creation of a new United Nations Development Framework. You have the SDG Partnership Platform as a flagship program of the United Nations and the government under UNDAF. The highest organ there below the governance of the UNDAF is the SDG Partnership Platform Steering Committee, which is chaired by the President and Sid Chatterjee as the UN Resident Coordinator. We then have 4 windows of SDG clusters. And these windows, as you will see, correspond directly to the Big Four action plan. So this is really a response to try and support the government and the people of Kenya around this Big Four priority. And for now, we've activated the first window, which is the one in green, the Health SDG cluster. And the aspiration is to drive universal primary health care as a component of UHC within the next 5 years. What we've done is created a thematic window, a coordination, and a technical working group. We have a number of partners coming on board. The first private sector partner that came in as a champion and signed the first agreement in New York was Royal Philips from the Netherlands. Since we've had support from bilaterals like the Netherlands government, we've had discussions and commitments of support that are being finalized with the World Bank, with a number of other private sector companies, Merck for Mothers. The Kenya Private Sector Alliance, which is the largest alliance of private sector companies in Kenya, also sits on the steering committee, as does the Council of Governors, which essentially is the aggregation of the 47 counties. There's a number of strategic partnerships under development, because as you see these 4 clusters, you also see the blue arrows going horizontally, which are essentially a number of cross-cutting opportunities. And one of the cross-cutting opportunities that philanthropy is very keen on, given the latest brain science in the Lancet series, is around early childhood development. And we see in some of the partnerships that we're working closely with the African ECD Network, the Kenya ECD Network, the Global ECD Action Network, and the platform is supporting the mission of the Global ECD Network as well. Recently, we were in a couple of weeks ago in Silicon Valley and had incredible discussions with Stanford, Berkeley, and a number of academia, a number of tech companies, including Google and Facebook. We also met with Packard Foundation and a number of other foundations, the Hilton Foundation. And we also met about 200 really tech-savvy, very successful entrepreneurial members of the Africa Diaspora Network at the Africa Diaspora Investment Symposium. And so a lot of interest has been stirred around how there could be knowledge partners that want to expand their work in Africa, how we can get human resource capital transfers, how we can get in-kind support, how we can leapfrog a number of the perennial problems of development through the latest technology, how we can apply telemedicine, how we can create an army of community health workers and task shift the activities that we need to apply in very rural settings, because we'll never have enough doctors and nurses given the expanding demographics. So there are great opportunities here to work with the artificial intelligence people, to work with the folks in telemedicine, the folks in data networks, referral systems, primary healthcare, vaccinations, reproductive and maternal child care, etc., etc. So that's really the focus of the health cluster. Subsequently, we will, in the next month or two, open up additional windows that you see there and leave the space open for further windows until we cover all 17 SDGs. The recognition I'd like to give here is to the resident coordinator of the UN as well as the government of Kenya, but also recognition to partners like the World Bank, partners like the Netherlands government, Philips and Merck and others who've come in very strongly with very strong support and interest. And what we do is we have steering committee meetings, and the steering committee will actually lead the process of analysis of data as we go through co-create workshops, county by county or in blocks of counties. Between now and mid-year, we want to try and develop primary healthcare strategies across all the 47 counties, identify key challenges, identify opportunities for engagement, identify what our friend Dr. Benny Banerjee from Stanford University calls the SDG acupuncture points, in order that we can develop transformative public-private partnership projects that can ultimately be put together as pre-feasibilities for potential public-private partnership investments. So it's really about moving in three phases: creating the platform, which is pretty much done. The second phase is around diagnostics, analytics, and identifying bankable opportunities. And then the third phase is the financial engineering, the feasibilities, and the negotiations around fiscal benefits, around access, around brand loyalty, etc., etc. The key question one would ask is why do these partners want to work through the platform and not simply carry on working directly and investing directly? And the answer is that we need to provide sufficient incentives and value add in working through a collaborative mechanism like a platform in order to reduce or at least mitigate some level of commercial and political risk, provide good access to government at national and county levels, to provide complete transparency, to also provide the opportunity of a common data fact file, which we're working on. We'd like to appreciate the role of McKinsey so far. McKinsey has given us about over 6 months of pro bono support, and a lot of partners have been very carefully looking at their own data and trying to see how they might contribute data in order that we can create one common data platform based on which the analytics can identify opportunities for investment. So some very exciting activities going on. In 2 weeks' time, in about 3 weeks' time, we will be hosting the first set of co-create workshops with 9 counties, including the 8 Frontier Counties Development Council counties in northern Kenya. And then we will work our way through the entire cohort of 47 counties between now and mid-year. And I think they should throw up some very interesting opportunities for academia, for technology, for innovations, but also for potential financiers and investors. So these are some of the achievements so far, as I described: the multi-partner trust fund, the window coordination, and broader consultations on co-create activities. We're looking at strengthening national and government capacities, and I'd like to really appreciate the leadership role of the Ministry of Health in the first window. The Minister for Health, or the Cabinet Secretary as we call them in Kenya, is the co-chairman of the health cluster with the UN resident coordinator. And we're delighted that we've had a very exciting and seamless transfer of leadership from Dr. Mailu, who was the previous Cabinet Secretary for Health, to Cecily Kariuki, who is now our new Honorable. Cecily Kariuki is our new Cabinet Secretary for Health, and we're looking forward very closely to her leadership and working with her in driving this this first window. The approach that we're taking is to really work at three levels: to work at the county level, as I mentioned, and really identify opportunities for collaborative action, but also to work at the national level. There are some opportunities like multi-tiered health insurance, like pay for service. We know that Africa's hospitals are oftentimes littered with graveyards of disused equipment simply because the maintenance contracts ran out or a particular piece of technology became obsolete, and taxpayers' money basically gets stuck in sunken assets. So, ideas like pay for service, where you could say, well, we'd like 20 million CAT scans next year, and we will pay on performance, and private sector can take care of the entire value chain of service delivery and technology upgrades. And also work at the third level, which is the global level. So we're looking to opportunities to engage with the World Economic Forum, with Every Woman, Every Child, with the GFF facility of the World Bank, with Gavi, with SUN, etc., the Global Health Fund, etc. So essentially, the idea is to try and create effective public-private partnerships to try and support the work of existing sector groups and existing donor groups in order that you simply adding some gas in the tank, so to speak, in accelerating the innovations and accelerating the financing for SDGs in Kenya. The immediate next steps are really around continuing the stakeholder consultations, the design and launch of specific SDG clusters that follow the first cluster, working with people like the Africa Diaspora Network and other stakeholders around providing opportunities for investments, for technical assistance and research, technology solutions and innovations, and around human talent. And we've already had very strong in-kind support from Philips, for example. The head of their Africa Innovation Hub has been kindly seconded to us for 2 years. They've also helped support the secondment by UNFPA of a partnership specialist to us for 2 years. World Bank is discussing with us the opportunity of some level of technical support. So there's a fairly interesting mix of intellectual capital and human capital coming together, which will drive the diagnostics phase. And then in terms of the specific public-private partnership investments, the platform would also help facilitate the negotiations around specific terms and conditions, working with the government and the county governments, making sure that the policies keep up to speed, making sure that fiscal incentives and other items can be discussed very openly and transparently, and essentially creating a one-stop enabling platform to drive public-private investments. And we hope that over time, this can lead to significant capital flowing to some of the most underserved areas in Kenya with respect to growing private sector investment opportunities, but also growing social impact through acceleration of SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for this very interesting presentation. We have a question from Abdul Rahim, and I'll give him the floor now so he can personally ask you the question.
Thank you.
Hello, this is my name is Abdul Rahim. So as I described, I am actually coordinating two projects which are funded by the European Union, European Commission. So these projects are funded in Africa. So it was like the funding was targeted for the Africa. Mainly we are targeting in the different countries in Africa. The first project that we started in 2 years, it's actually we are now in the 2 years. And this project is with the Senegal, Ghana, Togo, and Burkina Faso. And then after that, we have a follow-up project. It's called Wazi Hub, which will start in 1st of May, where with Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, South Africa are involved. So what we are really doing in this project, this is more technical project. So we are bringing IoT and big data, adaptation of IoT big data in Africa. So our main vision is to that IoT made in Africa. So we will develop different sort of the SDK or different toolkits. So ideas that this tool, based on these toolkits, African young entrepreneur should be able to rapid prototype a new IoT application for addressing sustainable development goal. So in our cases, all the technology are now we have addressing, doing piloting in different countries. So these are we are mostly focusing on the rural application, like the farming cases, like the fish farming, cattle monitoring, agriculture application, etc. So, and I personally see that especially IoT can make a very big contribution in the sustainable development goal. And this is what I am very much interested to learn how this result that we have developed in this project. Actually, it was developed by several European partners together with African partners. So we are working with several 15 that have techno hub, like innovation space and the incubator and etc. So my vision is to after we have another 3 years to go to this project, and I wanted to make it sustain. And obviously, I see sustainable is the only way to being the private people, entrepreneur, startup, young people to engage to do the rapid prototyping and do the application. And as I said, that Kenya, we have a partner also, the iLab Kenya, also involved in the project. So, and I am definitely very much interested to learn how we could also collaborate with this platform and how this could be sustained in at least in Kenya as well.
Well, thank you very much, Abdul Rahim. I appreciate your question, and then thank you for sharing your work with us. It sounds very interesting and very exciting. One of the organizations that came to my mind as you were speaking was, in fact, iLab and iHub, because as you know, Nairobi has become a hotbed of the Silicon Savannah. There's a lot of incubation and innovation hubs springing up, a lot of interest. And in fact, you might want to get on a plane, because next week we're having the Innovation Week in Kenya, hosted at the University of Nairobi, which brings on a very interesting mix of innovators from around the world and local innovators as well. But what you've described is very important. I think big data is also very important for an initiative that the President's Office has been driving, which is around the Global Initiative for Sustainable Data in the Kenya Data Forum, where they're taking 5 thematic areas, including agriculture, education, infrastructure, and what they're doing is in health. And what they're doing is they're trying to aggregate both public and private data and try and create some kind of an open source platform in order that they could be evidence-based decision making, much more so than we've had hitherto in the past. The other, of course, interesting thing is, as you said, that it provides a platform for a lot of young indigenous innovations to happen. And there's a significantly strong drive and infrastructure that the government is putting together to create an enabling environment, also through the ICT ministry, to encourage these kinds of innovations. So I think the kind of work you're doing would be very welcome here. I'm sure that you're already having a lot of good feedback, and if you're interested and want to work with the platform, we appreciate the interest. We're talking to a number of data groups as well, and what we would like to do is invite you to write to us. You see my email address there on the screen, and feel free to send us information on your work, and we'd be happy to we'd be happy to take this discussion further offline.
Thank you, Arif. I have a question for you. What is the biggest challenge that you're facing while brokering this partnership?
Yeah, thanks. I think the biggest challenge simply is that we're at the stage where we're creating the platform as we go along. So we don't have simply a template that we can pass around saying, look, this is the way it's going to be, this is the results we're going to get, and this is tested and proven in 20 other countries. But it's also the exciting part, because it helps us to innovate a homegrown platform. It helps us to attract local and global partners together. Whilst we're creating the platform, we're also trying to expand the intellectual firepower that we can put together. And so we're getting secondments. We're trying to synchronize secondments from different partners, bilaterals, multilaterals, or private sector. So I think really it's about the balance between creating a platform, providing incentives for private sector and philanthropy to come into collaborative action, and at the same time being true to the demand-driven priorities that the government has established around the SDGs. So it's making sure that we provide enough value add to incentivize private sector investments, and they see long-term investment potential, while at the same time we see the development impacts that we're looking for under the SDGs.
Hello, Arif. This is Johannes speaking. I'm the research intern here at SDGPP. I want to say thank you very much for everything. Very interesting stuff. I had one small question for you, and it was, have you come across many innovative solutions concerning ECD or education in your work?
Yes, I'm sorry, Johannes, I missed the name of your organization.
I'm here with UNDP, SDGPP.
Okay, yes, okay. So thanks. So we've seen some really interesting things happening. We've as we looked at early childhood development, for example, and I'll give you an example for other types of education, including technical vocational training. In early childhood development, what we saw was, as you look at the Lancet series and the latest brain science, it's clear that the most critical time where the most accelerated development of neural pathways in the brain occurs is in the first 1,000 days. And at that time, what you need is a multiple of thematic impacts coming simultaneously in different and varying strengths. So you need health, you need water and sanitation and hygiene, you need nutrition, you need love and affection and security, but you also need child protection. And as you look at these impacts, it's very clear that the awareness of the importance of this period was not there. Clearly, there are some champions out there, but generally the last few years, I think the focus on EFA and primary education, moving to secondary education and tertiary, tended to sort of leave ECD out. And some of us who've been sort of working with Aga Khan and the Madrasa program and the ECD initiatives for over the last 20, 30 years, have been very keen to put this on the agenda. So there's the advocacy agenda there, and there's some innovative things that are happening around the business case for investing in ECD, just as we did about probably 10, 15 years ago on developing the business case for investment in HIV/AIDS with your workforce. And this is not just about compassion and philanthropy and the love of humanity, but it's also about your bottom line, and it's about direct impacts for a company to retain their staff or to support their staff both on ECD and HIV/AIDS, rather than retrench your staff and actually rehire and retrain new people. So there's a business case there. And in terms of the fragmentation system-wide of these impacts across different areas, across local government counties and their offices, but also across private sector, because there are specialists in health and specialists in nutrition, but oftentimes they're not all talking to each other or connected. We developed a systems-based conversation through support from Change Labs at Stanford University, and it brought about 35 stakeholders from government, from the Office of the President, from NGOs, foundations, impact investors, social enterprises. And what we did was we did a sort of systems thinking workshop around what are the most appropriate and likely pathways to bridge these gaps. And this is not by any means an easy feat, but it is something that you can actually develop, plan, and aspire towards, particularly given that our new integrated ECD policy is under construction, and there's opportunities to tweak it and create the right coordination structures, even across ministries. So we launched after that an ECD Innovation Award competition. And to answer your question, the types of innovations we've seen have been very interesting. One has been around creating and identifying value chains for fortified manufacture of fortified nutrition for early childhood schools from local manufacturers that is WHO certified, and that can be providing local manufacturers and local private sector partners opportunities to enhance youth employment, but also ultimately provide the right needed nutrition in the right needed quality and benchmarks to very remote and alienated schools in parts of Kenya, which hitherto didn't have access to that kind of nutrition. And through these values, getting impact investors and getting private equity partners to actually invest in potential intermediary organizations within these value chains. So that's been quite an interesting innovation, and it's unfolding as we speak. The second one is around taking some of the frontline worker really at the end of the day on the ground. The frontline champions are your community health workers. And in almost all counties, they tend to be volunteers. Siaya County is probably the only example that I know of where community health workers are actually getting some direct remuneration from the county government. And I would like to commend the governor and team at Siaya County for that. And this will be really the location where we can test training of community health workers on mobile platforms. So what you're doing is you're actually putting training in the hands of community health workers in rural settings, where if you don't have internet or you don't even have a phone line, you can still continue your training, and we can have an M&E backbone that supports and tracks the progress of these community health workers. So ECD training through mobiles and through group facilitation are very interesting innovations that are coming together. On technical vocational education, we've taken training on mobile platforms in northern Kenya in a county called Marsabit, which is probably bigger than Belgium and Germany combined, with a huge desert in the middle, where UNDP has launched a Biashara center that's owned by the county government for training of entrepreneurs, but also training of skilled artisans. And the difficulty, as you can imagine, is for young people to cross that county and get to that center, and also to leave their livelihoods, because many young people are tending goats or running boda motorbike taxis or running kiosks. For them to leave their livelihoods and go for some training where there's no guaranteed job at the end of the day is always a difficult possibility. So taking the training on mobile platforms and passing it to them, and for them to be able to do the training and start it and stop it as and when they like, in between their livelihoods work, is really the innovation that is in place now in Marsabit County. And the government has given me very positive feedback about how that's going. So we're already seeing, very interesting innovators and opportunities coming up. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Arif. If there are any other questions, please let us know and we will give you the floor.
Arif, I have a question. This is Karolina Mzyk from SDG Philanthropy Platform and UNDP. I wanted to congratulate you as well, and also recognize your immense contribution to the platform in Kenya happening and taking this shape. Because I think without you, neither of this would be possible. Thanks to your charismatic nature, this is really rolling forward. And so my question to you is really a personal one. What would be your 3 personal advice on how to make this such a platform happen? From UN perspective, we all have this challenge of creating multi-stakeholder partnership platforms for the SDGs. But really, we know that it very much depends on the individuals. So give us your personal perspective on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question, Carolina, and thank you for your kind words and your kind sentiments. And I'd like to also express deep appreciation to you and the entire team for all the support that we've had over the years. And when we first met in November 2014, I think neither of us had any clue that this would be the evolution of the platform, and that we'd be sitting talking about $1 to $2 billion of PPPs in Kenya through the platform in less than 3 years. So it's been an exciting journey, and thank you for your support. In terms of your question, it's an interesting question. I think I would say probably the first one would be around essentially cultivating relationships. Cultivating very honest relationships based on integrity, based on open information, connecting the dots, being helpful in terms of support to philanthropy, private sector, civil society, government, UN, irrespective of which stakeholder is really looking for support, ensuring that there is a robust and healthy relationship that you build, and a relationship of trust and transparency and integrity. I think the second tip I would give is to really think about why people should collaborate. I personally have a philosophy that the world works on 2 reflexes. The first reflex is the love of God, humanity, and compassion. And the second reflex is enlightened self-interest. And what I mean by enlightened self-interest is that one needs to find the win-win for people to come together. What's the additional value add for collaboration rather than going and doing it alone? And lining up your incentives and lining up your benefits to private sector, to philanthropy, to government, to the UN, in order that you incentivize people to work together. And I think that's a really important one, because otherwise you get little puffs of partnership or collaboration, but they essentially die out and they simmer off. But if you can sustain the incentives, then you can sustain the long-term partnerships and collaborations. And you need a clear backbone for those types of partnerships. So you really need a platform-type backbone that can be the honest broker and drive all the stakeholders to work together. And we're seeing that there is a lot of appreciation of this role of the UN as an honest broker. And the third one, I think, is around really timing. I think in Kenya we're lucky because the timing is the 3 Ps have come together. And I'm not talking just about public-private partnerships, but the other 3 Ps is that we've got the political will, right from the highest level of government, all the way down to the counties, down to the county executive heads of health, of education, etc. So the political will is extremely strong, and we have a very clear political agenda that's drawn up in terms of the big 4 and what needs to drive it, and the cross-cutting opportunities like gender and early childhood development and the like. So the first P is political will. The second P, I think, is around policies, and I think we've got some very strong policies. There are some under construction, there are some under refinement, but essentially the basic building blocks of policies are in place. And Kenya has always been, a welcome destination for foreign direct investment and local investment. And so I think the culture really is about easing the doing business opportunity in Kenya and making sure that you take away bureaucratic hurdles and impediments and actually make it a much more efficient and effective process for investors. And of course, your fiscal regulations are important there in terms of repatriation of dividends and the like. And the third P, I think, is around partnerships. And really making sure that you forge serious partnerships, because when it comes to SDGs, when it comes to addressing the issue of almost half the population of the country being under the line, under the poverty line, no single entity has a magic solution. No sector alone can do it. And so really making sure that there's a sense that partnerships are the only way to work, and partnerships is the way we can all do this together. And the SDG framework gives us that wonderful opportunity to collaborate on the goal number 17. And in these partnerships, making sure that there's enlightened self-interest, but there's also clear impact measurement as well. So it's not just, a lot of interesting activities and a lot of sound and fury around activities, but ultimately impacts on the ground. And innovation and technology are really the levers that I think can help us leapfrog some of these partnership opportunities. And financing is also an important element of these partnerships. So when I talk about SDG funding to financing, I think working in partnerships with a whole range of blended finance partners is extremely important. And so we're very excited that the platform has been very centrally involved in the group that's been working at trying to launch the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance on the 14th of March. And these are the kinds of initiatives where you can actually bring the right players together. And I believe that in private sector, there is no lack of capital. It's a lack of deal flow. It's a lack of absorptive capacity. It's a lack of debt servicing cash flows that can actually service debt. So if we can provide a pipeline of transformative projects that have been vetted, that have clear feasibility studies and sensitivity analysis, and are profitable, but at the same time are hitting SDG impacts, then I think we're onto a good thing. And that's where I think we can sustain partnerships. So thank you, Carolina, for that question.
Thank you, Arif. And I think with these Julia and Natalia, do we have any more questions?
No, Carolina, we don't have any other questions.
So, Arif, thank you so much. Dear participants, thank you very much for tuning in today. This has been an exciting presentation that will be available online. And I also would like to wish Arif and the Kenya team all the best and the next success in making this platform a reality. So thanks a lot, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.